Hey, welcome to Monday with Mark from the depths of my garage tonight. This is where all the magic happens in church replanting, right here in my garage. No, not really. Actually, I'm in my garage because I have behind me here a pulpit. I mean, who doesn't have a pulpit in your garage, right? Well, this just isn't any pulpit, all right? This is the pulpit from which my dad preached for over 25 years. And the varnish is all worn off on the sides where he would place his hands and hold them there as he preached the gospel. It's also the pulpit from which I preached my very first sermon at age 16. And believe me, I haven't gotten a whole lot better since. If you'll notice this old pulpit, and I'll try to get you a better look at it here, it's got some pretty worn places. And, you know, basically, it's a mid-century pulpit. And even for a mid-century pulpit, it wasn't all that attractive. Someone put on Facebook after I put a picture of it, they said, man, that reminds me of your dad. Practical, not flashy, but very useful. That is my dad. Practical, not flashy, but very useful. And it's an old workhorse of a pulpit. You know, I realize now as I'm older, my dad preached behind this pulpit on Sunday after his mother died. He preached behind this pulpit after he found out his wife had cancer. He preached behind this pulpit after he found out he had health issues. He preached behind this pulpit when he was worried about me and my sisters and our lives. And he preached behind this pulpit when he knew families out in the congregation were going through all kinds of heartache and trouble. He preached every week behind this pulpit, and he preached faithfully the gospel. And I'm grateful for him. And this old pulpit means a lot to me. But why do I have it? Well, that's even the best news. You see, when my dad was the pastor at Emmanuel Baptist here in Independence, Missouri, the church grew to 500, 600 people, had 2 services, packed them out every Sunday, and my dad preached the gospel from behind this pulpit. Not only my dad, but many other men. Not just me, there were a number of young men who preached their first sermon from behind this pulpit. My dad was always passionate about raising up young pastors and young preachers. But Emmanuel Baptist had dwindled from about 400 or 500 to about 40. And coming out of COVID, they realized they just weren't going to be able to come out of COVID. And let me just say that in terms of COVID, a lot of churches with pre-existing conditions that weren't healthy to begin with, they're going to realize they don't have the strength to come back after COVID. And God can use that for his glory, actually. And so it was really coming out of COVID that helped Emmanuel realize we're not just one preacher away. You know, a lot of dying churches think, well, we just call the right man, we'll be able to turn this thing around. We're not just one preacher away from turning it around. We passed that already. We need a more drastic solution. And that means we're going to, have to let go of all of our past and embrace a brand new future. And that includes this old pulpit. Now, they had quit using this pulpit years ago, but symbolically, they have to let go. The history behind this is incredible. We don't want to forget it. You know, when we first started church replanting, we called it legacy replanting. And I still think of it that way. We don't use the word legacy replanting because it's just too long of a word to put on a shirt or a hat, so we just call it replanting. But it is legacy replanting because we're replanting a church not out of nothing, but on the legacy of the preaching of the gospel and the people who went before us. And that's really important to remember. You see, what my dad wouldn't want to have happen, now that he's gone and he's in heaven with my mom, what he wouldn't want to have happen is for Emmanuel to close its doors. Sits there on 23rd and Main in Independence for 75, 80 years and tells the whole community, we believe Jesus is the Son of God. We believe the Bible. We believe Jesus is the hope of the world. Oh, but wait a minute. Jesus couldn't keep this church open past 80 years. That's the last thing my dad would want. That's the last thing any of those founding members of Emmanuel would want. And having grown up in that church, I knew a lot of the original founding members who started that church. And they gave their money, their time, their love, their passion, their energy. And countless numbers of people have come to know Christ and became missionaries and pastors because of the ministry of that church and the preaching behind this old pulpit. But there comes a time when a church has to realize the neighborhood's not like it was in 1970. The community's not like it used to be. We have to embrace the changes that Jesus wants us to embrace. And here's the problem. As churches grow older, the world changes so rapidly, they begin to value the consistency of the old ways of doing things more than they value what Jesus would have them to do. Now, that's hard to say, but it's true. And the last thing we would like to have happen is for the gospel ministry that began and preached behind this pulpit to go away. Well, I've got news for you. It's not going away. Those 40 or so brave souls at Emmanuel coming out of COVID, and as we're still in it, they realized we can't come back. And so they reached out to another church in town, a church that loved them and cared for them, Abundant Life Church. They've come in, they've invested an incredible amount of resources, both in terms of money and people, and they're planning to launch brand new in February. They're already planning on having 2 services the very first Sunday. It's going to be incredibly different than the old Emmanuel was, but it's going to be exactly like the gospel that my father preached and loved and cared for all of those years. The gospel is going to continue. Lives are going to be changed. Marriages are going to be saved. Neighborhoods are going to be transformed. And that's what matters. That's what glorifies God. That's what Satan hates. And that's the warfare and the battle we're in. And so, saints, the battle you have to fight is the battle in your own heart to say, I'm willing to lay down my preferences and my nostalgia and the way I like to do things in order that the gospel can be made known to this community. No, we replant on the legacy of those who've gone before us. And we want to honor that legacy. And I honor this pulpit. And I love every nick, every scratch, every handprint on this pulpit. And I treasure it. But its usefulness at Emmanuel was over. It's a new day. And they're going a different direction. And it needs to happen. So if you're watching this, or as you're watching this, I want to give you really quickly 4 things you can do in your church to help move them from where they are to where they need to be. Number 1, create a sense of urgency. So many dying churches just don't see the reality of their condition. Have you ever known people go to a doctor and the doctor takes their blood pressure and takes their blood and comes back and says, listen, you've got some problems. These things don't look good. And the person goes, no, I feel pretty good. I think I'm all right. I'm not going to change my habits. I'll keep eating salt and keep eating fat and keep doing what I want because I feel fine. And my granddad lived to be 90s. And that happens all the time. The same thing happens in churches. Look around, you go, man, you used to be 400, but now you're 40. Yeah, I know, we've gone down a little bit, but other churches have too, and we're not dead yet. And we can just, we had a new family visit a few weeks ago, and they just totally deny it. And Satan wants us to not have a sense of urgency. So create a sense of urgency. Help them understand what is at stake. The gospel witness of that church, the glory of God is at stake in that place. You realize if that church is closed, its doors, if your church closes its doors, it robs God of his glory. Because what about a dying church says, our God is great and his gospel is powerful. And Satan wants to rob God of his glory. And when you think of the men who preach behind this pulpit, you think of the hours that my dad spent proclaiming the gospel and the lives that were changed. You don't want that to go away. You don't want that to stop. You don't want to sell this building and to become an office building or a parking lot. You want it to continue to be a church. And unless we help people understand the urgency of the situation, that time is short, that they may not have very many months left, very many years left before this church is going to be forced to close its doors. I was with Richard Blackaby not long ago, and Richard said he was with the pastor. And the pastor said, we just have to close our church. And Richard said, no church has to close. You choose to do that. He said, no, you don't understand. We can't pay our bills. We're behind on our utilities. We don't have any money. We're going to have to close our church. And Richard said, well, now you do. But what about 5 years ago? What about 10 years ago? What decisions did you not make 10 years ago that you should have made that have brought you to where you are today? What decisions did you make 5 years ago you shouldn't have made that brought you where you are today? And so there has to be a sense of urgency that says, unless we do something. And I want to tell you, there are some churches that are around Emmanuel in Independence, Missouri. Those of you from Missouri know what I'm talking about, that have actually closed their doors. Churches of the same age and same size, they're gone. Several of them. It happens. And I think the fact that some of those other churches closed their doors did make some of these people at Emmanuel realize, that very well could happen to us. And yes, it could. But it doesn't have to happen because there are other churches willing to help you. You've just got to be willing to let go and let God do whatever he wants to do with your church. Jesus has a plan for every church, and he will see to it, but we have to submit ourselves to his plan. And that's hard to do. But create a sense of urgency, all right? Got to do that. Number 2, work with a coalition of the willing. In other words, you're not going to get the whole church usually to come along with you, but create a team out there, a vision team, a next steps team, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe put some deacons on it, some other leaders. Pray and ask the Lord to give you insight into people who will be sensitive to the leadership of the Holy Spirit and who are willing to work together and who love the community, and bring together a team, and then expose that team to all kinds of possibilities of what Jesus is doing with his church across North America. I'll send you copies of my book for that team. Talk to your director of missions locally. Say, will you come and meet with this team? Talk to your state convention. Will you come and meet with this team? Email me. I will Zoom conference with that team. And if you're within driving distance, I'll come and meet with them. Whatever it takes, we can hook you up with other churches who are just like you that have been through this, and that team can talk to people from that church. In other words, take a group of 4 or 5 or 6 people and expose them to what God is doing in replanting dying churches, and let them get a vision of it, and let Jesus plant that in their heart, so that you're not the only one trying to convince your church, and you're not just bringing an outsider to do that. It is much better if an inside group of people who are part of that body are able to communicate to their own brothers and sisters in Christ, this is the direction we need to go. And I can't emphasize enough how many of your state conventions have all kinds of resources. They will come and help you with surveys on your church, on your community health surveys, church health surveys. We can give you all kinds of information, but pastors always say, I don't know where to start. Well, start by praying, number 1. And number 2, start by pulling together a small group and give them our book, Reclaiming Glory. Give them Flickering Lamps by Richard Blackaby. Give them any number of things. Biblical Church Revitalization by Brian Croft. Talk to your director of missions. Talk to your state convention person. But begin to work with a coalition, a small group, a visionary group, a coalition of the willing. Number 3, be willing to move along even if 100% of the people aren't with you. Sometimes in dying churches, and we've gotten down to a group of 30 or 40 people, we all know each other really well, and unless we're all together, we don't want to move. Sister so-and-so, she's not with us on this, and brother so-and-so, he's not really wanting to do this. And so 1 or 2 or 3 people can really hold it back, or maybe 4 or 5. You're always going to have those who are going to always resist the change. Even at this sweet church Emmanuel, there are some people who still just don't see it, and are still really are hurting over that. And I'm sorry for that. But the majority of people see the joy that's coming and the possibility, but there are always going to be some. And so you have to be willing to move on and know that those who are late adapters will either adapt, or they'll leave, or they'll just become normal with it. You can't wait for everybody to be on board. And sometimes that's what they do in dying churches. They try to wait for everybody to be on board. And you simply can't do that. And then lastly, you want to pray that they find a greater joy in Jesus and what he wants for this church than in the history and the legacy of this church. And you do that through your preaching. In other words, right now, they feel such an affection and attachment to the building, to the furnishings like this old pulpit, to the pews, to the painted baptistry, to the Sunday school class I sat in, to the way we do church, with everything else in my life that's so uncertain and unknown right now. It's such a comfort to spend a couple hours a week in a place that's familiar. You have to help them lay down the joy they feel in that familiarity and the joy they feel in that nostalgia for a much greater joy. And that is the joy of doing what Jesus wants them to do and being what he wants them to be, so that the church can have a future. Look, we are planting churches, and now we are replanting churches. And we're not replanting them out of nothing. We replant them on the legacy of the men and women who've gone before. Now listen to me. The best way to honor that legacy is to let go of those things that will cause the church to die, and embrace those things that will give life and vitality to the church once again. I look at this old pulpit, and I know that the man who stood behind there for 25 years, he would lay everything down in order to see the gospel be made known. I'll just tell you one story about him. We were reaching so many children back in those days in the 1970s, and the building was packed with kids, and we had children's church. And I remember we lived in the parsonage right behind the church building. And I remember one Sunday, my dad wasn't home for dinner yet, so I went back up to the church to see what he was doing. My mom said, "See where your dad is." So I went back up there, and my dad, this is a church of 400 or 500, but my dad was in the restrooms and kind of cleaning up the paper towels because the kids had made a terrible mess. And I remember just saying, "Dad, you shouldn't be doing this." And I remember just trying to be friendly to him. And I said, "Man, these kids, they are so disrespectful. Look how dirty these restrooms are and how awful they are." And I mean this with all my heart. I'll never forget this. My dad turned around. He had like paper towels in his hand. He was throwing things away, and he had tears in his eyes. Because when my dad came to Emmanuel, there was barely 100 people there. And he said, "Mark, this is why we have church, so that it gets dirty like this." He said, "Every one of these paper towels is a little kid that got to hear the gospel today. This is what matters. What matters is our people hearing the gospel. What matters is not the furniture we use. It's not the building we're in. It's not the traditions we have. It's that our little children hearing the gospel." And I got to tell you, some of you are watching right now, and you know who you are, and you were one of those little children, and you heard the gospel at Emmanuel Baptist Church, and you know Jesus Christ, and your kids know Jesus Christ because of that preaching and the love and the affection of that church. And I've got good news for you. It's just going to get better in the next few years. And I don't care who you are tonight. If you're a church and you're dying and you're struggling, you don't have to be. We don't want to ignore your legacy. We'll build on that legacy in legacy replanting. Talk to your director of missions. Talk to your state convention leader. Email me at replant@nam.net. But let's get this conversation started. And let's build a strong legacy of planting and replanting on a foundation of gospel preaching churches all across North America.